The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a quiet whisper of the vast wilderness stretching across Denali National Park, Alaska. In the heart of this untamed land, a solitary log cabin stood nestled between towering spruce trees, its wooden walls weathered by years of brutal winters and scorching summers. The July heat was unlike anything the region had seen before, dry, oppressive, and unrelenting, an unnatural silence hovering over the land as if the forest itself sensed the coming disaster. Inside the cabin, Daniel Carter, a retired U.S. Forest Service investigator, sat on his porch, staring at the distant mountain ridge. He had spent 25 years tracking arsonists and illegal loggers, uncovering the secrets hidden in the ashes of wildfires. But those days were long behind him. 3 years ago, after a case gone wrong, he had walked away from it all, trading Washington, D.C. for the peace of the Alaskan backcountry. Here, away from people, away from the ghosts of his past, he had found a fragile sort of peace. His cabin, a two-room structure built by his own hands, was his sanctuary. Days were spent fishing in the Kantishna River, hiking the forest trails, and chopping wood for the cold nights. The only sounds that accompanied him were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional cry of a distant wolf. No news, no responsibilities, no danger. But that peace was shattered on a fateful night when a desperate barking echoed through the trees. The sound jolted Daniel awake. At first, he thought it was a dream, just another restless night filled with memories he had tried to bury. But when he heard the sharp, insistent bark again, followed by the frantic scratching of claws against wood, he knew something was wrong. Gun instinctively in hand, he moved toward the front door. His cabin was deep in the wilderness, miles away from the nearest road. No hikers, no tourists, no visitors. The only creatures that wandered this far were grizzlies, moose, and the occasional lost fox. But a dog? That was unheard of. With cautious steps, he unlocked the door and swung it open. There, standing in the dim moonlight, was a Belgian Malinois, its muscular frame tense, its amber eyes locked onto Daniel with an intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. The dog's coat, black and tan, streaked with dirt and dried blood, stood out against the forest backdrop. Despite the exhaustion evident in its stance, it did not appear injured. Daniel had seen enough trained dogs in his career to recognize one when he saw it. This was no stray. "Hey there, boy," Daniel said softly, lowering his weapon. The dog barked sharply, then took several steps backward, turning toward the tree line. It stopped, looking back at him, waiting. Daniel frowned. Years of reading body language, of analyzing trails and following the smallest signs in nature, told him everything he needed to know. This dog wasn't lost. It was leading him somewhere. Then, he smelled it. Smoke. Faint, but unmistakable, the acrid scent of burning wood carried on the wind. Daniel's eyes snapped to the horizon. Through the thick forest canopy, an orange glow pulsed in the distance, flickering like a heartbeat. That definitely wasn't the sunrise. He stepped back into the cabin, grabbed his boots, a flashlight, and his emergency bag. The fire was still far, but in this heat, it wouldn't stay that way for long. The dog barked again, more urgent this time. It turned and started down the trail, pausing every few yards to make sure Daniel was following. His instincts screamed at him. Something bigger was happening here. And he was about to find out what. Daniel moved swiftly through the dense forest, his boots crunching against the dry underbrush as he followed the Belgian Malinois deeper into the unknown. The dog moved with purpose, never hesitating, always checking to make sure he was still following. Though he had lived in this part of Alaska for 3 years, the path the dog led him down was unfamiliar, a narrow, winding trail cutting through the thick spruce trees, the air growing heavier with each step. The acrid sting of smoke burned his nostrils, and the deeper they went, the more unmistakable the signs of fire became. Ash drifted through the air, glowing embers swirling like fireflies caught in an invisible current. Overhead, birds screeched and took flight, fleeing the coming inferno. Daniel knew how quickly fire could consume a forest, how it crawled through the undergrowth like a living beast, devouring everything in its path. Whatever had started this blaze was moving fast. Too fast. Then he saw it, a dirt road, barely visible through the thick haze. The dog sprinted ahead, its paws kicking up dust, and Daniel followed, breaking through the last stretch of trees. His breath caught at the sight before him. A wrecked SUV lay wedged against a massive tree, its front end crumpled like paper. The windshield was cracked, spiderwebbed with impact fractures, and steam hissed from the engine, barely visible through the rising thick smoke. Small flames flickered from underneath the hood, creeping outward as if tasting the dry summer air before growing stronger. And then, movement inside. Daniel rushed forward, ignoring the burn of smoke in his lungs. He pressed himself against the driver's side window and shone his flashlight through the fractured glass. A woman slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling down from a gash on her forehead. Even in the dim light, he could tell she was young, mid to late 20s, long dark hair matted with sweat and soot. Her lips moved, but her eyes remained shut. Daniel banged on the glass. "Hey! Can you hear me?" A soft groan. Her head lolled to the side, and for the briefest second, her eyes fluttered open. "Brakes," she murmured. "They failed. Someone tampered with them." Daniel stiffened. Not an accident. But there was no time to process that. The fire was spreading fast, flames licking up the hood, creeping toward the gas tank. He tried the driver's door. Jammed. The dog barked, running to the other side of the car. Daniel followed, yanking on the passenger door. It gave way with a screech. "Come on," he muttered, moving quickly. The woman was barely conscious as he reached for her, her body limp with shock and injury. He lifted her from the seat, careful not to jostle her leg, which was trapped beneath a crumpled part of the dashboard. As soon as she was freed, the dog moved in beside them, whining anxiously. Daniel hauled her into his arms just as the flames crawled into the interior, touching the upholstery. The fire ignited. A blast of heat hit him as he stumbled backward, carrying her away from the wreck. Then, an explosion. The car erupted, a deafening roar splitting the night as fire engulfed the wreckage. A shock wave of heat and debris rushed past him, singeing his exposed skin. Daniel shielded the woman's body with his own, crouching low until the flames settled into a roaring inferno. Behind him, the dog stood guard, its eyes locked on the burning wreck. Daniel took a breath and looked down at the woman in his arms. She was awake now, dazed, blinking up at him with eyes full of confusion and fear. "My name's Daniel Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You're safe now." The dog let out a low growl, ears perked toward the burning car. Daniel followed its gaze. Something about this wasn't over. Something was still out there. Daniel laid Sophia Lawson gently on the damp earth, his pulse still hammering from the explosion behind them. The fire roared through the trees, consuming the crashed SUV in its fiery grip, but his focus was on the woman before him. Her eyelids fluttered as she fought to stay conscious. She coughed weakly, her breath raspy from the smoke. Daniel pulled a small canteen from his pack and tipped it to her lips. She drank greedily, her body trembling as awareness slowly returned to her. Her gaze locked onto his, searching for answers. "Where?" she rasped. "You're safe," Daniel assured her, though he wasn't sure how true that was. "Can you tell me what happened?" Sophia took a shaky breath, eyes flickering with recognition and urgency. "My brakes," she murmured. "They were cut." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of tension through his body. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had tried to kill her. He studied her closely now, noting the way her fingers curled protectively around a small satchel still strapped across her body. The dog, still standing guard beside them, let out a low whimper, nudging Sophia's arm as if urging her to keep talking. "What were you doing out here?" Daniel asked, his tone quiet but firm. Sophia swallowed hard, her throat raw from the smoke. "I'm an investigative journalist," she said. "I've been tracking Blackridge Development Corporation for months. They're logging illegally, wiping out protected land, bribing officials to look the other way." She coughed again, shuddering. I had proof. Photos. Documents. Daniel's gut twisted. This wasn't just a wildfire. It was a cover-up. The fire had started too fast, too aggressively. If Blackridge had wanted to erase evidence, burning the entire forest would be the perfect way to do it. He exhaled sharply. You think they tried to kill you? Sophia nodded weakly. They've done it before, she whispered. People who cross them disappear. Before Daniel could respond, the dog barked sharply, its body tensed as it turned toward the forest. Daniel's instincts flared. Something was ahead. The dog whined and took off, disappearing into the thick smoke. Daniel hesitated for only a second before pulling Sophia to her feet. Come on, he said. We have to move. They followed the dog through the choking haze, weaving between towering flames that had begun climbing up the trees like living creatures. Daniel could barely make out the shapes of fallen branches, the ground beneath them a shifting mess of embers and debris. The smoke thickened, burning his throat and stinging his eyes. But then, through the chaos, screaming. A woman's desperate cries cut through the fire's roar. Daniel turned toward the sound and saw it, a collapsed wooden shelter, half buried in burning debris. The entrance was blocked, and inside, a family of 4 was trapped. A mother, wild-eyed with fear, pounded on the broken wood. Behind her, 2 young children, a boy and a girl, sobbed against their father, who had his arm wrapped around them. Help us, the mother begged. Daniel rushed forward, dropping to his knees. Stay back, he ordered. I'm getting you out. The dog barked and scratched at the wood, as if urging Daniel to move faster. The flames were closing in fast. Daniel knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the structure became a death trap. He braced himself and grabbed hold of a half-broken support beam, straining to push it aside. It didn't budge. The father coughed violently, his body sagging under the weight of smoke inhalation. The mother's eyes filled with panic. Daniel gritted his teeth and forced himself to push harder, adrenaline surging through him. With a crack, the wood gave way. Go, go, he urged, helping the mother and children crawl out first. The father tried to follow, but as soon as he stepped forward, he collapsed. Daniel caught him just in time, throwing the man's arm over his shoulder. The dog grabbed the man's sleeve in its teeth, pulling with remarkable strength. Together, they half-carried, half-dragged him away from the burning wreckage. They stumbled toward a clearing, where the air was slightly clearer. Daniel lowered the man to the ground as his wife and children clung to him, sobbing in relief. The mother turned to Daniel, tears streaking her soot-covered face. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel gave a short nod, but before he could say anything, the dog let out a sharp, urgent bark. Daniel's head snapped toward it. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, ears pricked, body tense. Then, without hesitation, it bolted into the darkness. Daniel's stomach dropped. Something was out there. And whatever it was, the dog was going after it. The Belgian Malinois disappeared into the swirling smoke, its silhouette barely visible against the burning forest. Daniel didn't hesitate. He wiped the sweat from his brow, inhaled sharply, and took off after the dog. His lungs burned, the air thick with ash, but his instincts screamed at him to keep moving. The fire wasn't spreading naturally, it was too fast, too targeted. And now, the dog was leading him somewhere important. Through the dense trees, Daniel spotted a structure ahead, a ranger station, its wooden exterior darkened with soot but still standing. It looked abandoned, forgotten in the chaos of the wildfire. Then he heard it. Coughing. Weak, desperate. Daniel's heart pounded as he reached the station's entrance. The dog was already inside, pacing anxiously near the corner of the dimly lit room. 3 figures huddled in the shadows, a young man and woman, no older than their early 20s, and an older man sprawled against the wall, his breaths ragged and uneven. Daniel knelt beside the elderly man. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, and blood seeped from a deep gash on his leg. But what caught Daniel's attention was what the man was clutching against his chest, a camera. The old man cracked open one swollen eye. "You're not with them?" he rasped. Daniel frowned. "Who?" The man's fingers tightened around the camera. "Blackridge," he whispered. Daniel exchanged a glance with the dog, a cold weight settling in his gut. The college students leaned forward. The young woman, her face streaked with soot, spoke first. "We were hiking when the fire started," she explained. "We ran into Jack, he was taking pictures, then men with gasoline cans showed up." Daniel stiffened. "The fire didn't start naturally," the young man continued, his voice shaking. "They set it on purpose." Jack coughed violently, shifting in pain. "I got pictures," he muttered, patting the camera. "Illegal clear-cutting, trucks hauling away protected trees, and then them setting up fire accelerants. They saw me. Tried to shut me up." His lips curled bitterly. "Didn't quite finish the job." Daniel's blood ran cold. This wildfire was never meant to be an accident. It was meant to cover up a crime. Before he could process what to do next, the dog let out a sudden growl, ears pinned forward, body tense. Daniel turned toward the door. Someone was coming. And they weren't here to rescue them. The ranger station was suffocating with heat and smoke, but it wasn't the fire that made Daniel's pulse quicken, it was the dog's growl. Instinctively, he turned toward the entrance, reaching for the knife strapped to his belt. The dog was locked in a rigid stance, ears pinned forward, a deep, menacing snarl rumbling from its throat. And then he saw the figure emerge from the smoke. A man, dressed in tactical gear, rifle gripped tightly in his hands, stepped into the dimly lit station. His boots crunched against the charred wooden floor, his face streaked with soot, but Daniel recognized him immediately. Logan Parrish. A firefighter. One of the heroes battling the wildfire. Except he wasn't here to save anyone. The smirk on Parrish's face made Daniel's stomach turn. The way he carried himself, calm, deliberate, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't some rogue vigilante. This man was on a mission. "No witnesses," Parrish said smoothly, raising the rifle. His voice was calm, almost casual. "I was hoping the fire would take care of things, but I guess I have to handle it myself." Sophia stiffened beside Daniel, her breath catching. "You're with Timbercorp." Parrish chuckled, eyes flicking to her. "Smart girl. Your little expose would have cost my employers a lot of money. Can't have that." He tilted his head slightly, amused. "I'll admit, I didn't expect you to survive the crash." Sophia clenched her jaw. "You cut my brakes." Parrish shrugged. "Don't take it personally." Daniel didn't waste time talking. His mind was already working, analyzing angles, measuring the space between him and the rifle. He needed a distraction, a split second of chaos. The dog moved before he could. With a feral snarl, the Belgian Malinois lunged. Parrish barely had time to react before 65 pounds of muscle and fury latched onto his forearm, teeth sinking deep into his flesh. The gun fired, but the shot went wild, embedding into the wooden ceiling. Daniel took his chance. He lunged forward, slamming into Parrish's chest with full force. They crashed into the floor, the rifle slipping from Parrish's grasp. The dog released him and darted back, blood dripping from its jaws. Parrish threw a punch, catching Daniel across the jaw. Pain flared, but Daniel didn't let go. He wrestled for the gun, fingers closing around the barrel just as Parrish did the same. They fought for control, rolling over the floor, the heat of the fire seeping into the wood beneath them. Another shot rang out. Daniel barely registered the yelp of pain before he saw it. The dog staggered back, a graze on its hind leg. Rage surged through him. With a final, brutal twist, Daniel ripped the gun from Parrish's grip and slammed the butt into his temple. The firefighter collapsed, dazed, but still breathing. Before Daniel could process their next move, shouts filled the air. Heavy boots. Multiple voices. A flood of figures in FBI tactical gear stormed into the station, weapons drawn. Hands where we can see them. Daniel exhaled, heart still racing. Sophia stumbled forward, pointing at Parrish. "He's with Timbercorp," she gasped. "He started the fire." One of the agents holstered his weapon and stepped forward. "We know," he said grimly. "We've been tracking him for weeks. Thanks to Sophia's distress call, we got here in time." Parrish groaned on the floor, blinking dazedly as handcuffs snapped onto his wrists. The FBI had arrived. But Daniel couldn't think about that yet. He turned to the dog. It stood on 3 legs, panting, blood soaking its hind leg. But even in pain, its eyes never left him. Daniel knelt beside him, pressing a firm hand against the wound. "You did good, boy," he murmured. "Real good." The dog let out a soft whine, pressing its nose against Daniel's hand. They had survived. But this wasn't over yet. The sky above Denali National Park was a murky haze of ash and smoke, the wildfire raging for hours before the firefighters gained control. From the ranger station, Daniel watched as dozens of men and women in heavy protective gear worked tirelessly to beat back the flames, their silhouettes illuminated by the orange glow of the burning trees. Helicopters roared overhead, dumping gallons of water on the worst of the blaze, while ground crews carved fire breaks to stop the destruction from spreading. The town of Healy, just beyond the park's edge, had been at serious risk. If the fire had jumped the natural barriers, homes, businesses, and entire families could have been lost. But thanks to Daniel, Sophia, and the dog, Bravo, the evacuation had been ordered in time, and no lives had been claimed by the flames. Daniel ran a hand across his sweat-streaked face, watching the controlled chaos of emergency responders bringing order back to nature's fury. He knew firsthand that not all wildfires were natural, some were the work of greed, of men who saw forests as nothing more than dollar signs waiting to be turned to ash. And now, they had proof. Inside one of the mobile FBI command stations, Sophia sat next to Jack Miles, the elderly photographer whose pictures would soon shake the foundations of Black Ridge Development Corp. Jack's hands were shaky, his breathing slow but steady as he pulled the memory card from his battered camera. "Everything's on here," he murmured, sliding it toward the lead investigator. "You'll find images of their illegal logging sites, photos of fire accelerants they planted, and even a few bribery exchanges between company officials and local authorities." Sophia's hands clenched into fists. "This wasn't just about the trees," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "They were covering up environmental destruction and endangering lives. The fire was just another tactic to erase evidence." The FBI agent handling the case, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Monroe, nodded. "With these photos and Sophia's investigation, we have enough to bring down Timbercorp's entire operation." Within hours, the arrests began. Timbercorp executives, corrupt local officials, and Logan Parrish's co-conspirators were taken into custody. But the biggest blow came when Sophia's article hit national headlines. With the full backing of the FBI's findings, Sophia published a damning exposé in the Washington Post, detailing Black Ridge's corruption, the illegal destruction of protected forests, and the attempted cover-up through wildfire. The public outrage was immediate. Government officials rushed to issue new protections for Denali's forests, stricter regulations on logging permits, and a full-scale environmental audit of corporations operating in protected lands. Timbercorp had set the fire to destroy evidence, but instead, they burned themselves down. As the dust settled, Daniel found himself back at the ranger station, sitting next to Bravo. The dog's hind leg was bandaged, but he was otherwise fine, tough, determined, and as sharp as ever. Sophia approached, crouching beside them. Her eyes shimmered with something deeper than gratitude as she reached out, brushing her fingers through Bravo's thick fur. "You saved my life," she whispered. "Again." Daniel frowned. "Again?" Sophia nodded, swallowing hard. I think I know who he is." She turned toward the dog, her voice softer than before. "Bravo?" The dog's ears perked, and his head tilted ever so slightly, eyes locking onto her. Sophia exhaled sharply, tears suddenly pooling in her eyes. "I thought I lost you," she murmured, voice cracking. Daniel watched, confused but intrigued. Sophia turned back to him. "Bravo was my father's canine partner." Daniel blinked. "Your father?" Sophia nodded. "Officer Mark Lawson. He was a state investigator, just like you. He spent years tracking environmental crimes, and he was closing in on Blackridge's illegal operations." Daniel's stomach twisted. He had heard of Mark Lawson, one of the best, known for his relentless pursuit of justice. But he had died mysteriously in a car accident years ago. Sophia swallowed. "That accident, it wasn't an accident. I think they killed him. And after he died, Bravo disappeared." Daniel's gaze shifted to the dog, realization dawning. "He didn't disappear," he murmured. "He stayed." Bravo had never left. For years, he had been watching over the very land Mark Lawson had fought to protect. He had survived on his own, patrolling the wilderness, following his instincts, still searching for justice. And when Sophia returned to finish what her father started, Bravo found her again. Sophia let out a small laugh, even as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I always wondered why I felt like someone was watching over me out here." She buried her face into the dog's fur, whispering, "You never stopped protecting us, did you?" Bravo let out a soft whine, pressing against her, as if to say, "Never." Daniel sat back, a slow smile creeping onto his face. He had always trusted his instincts, and now, he realized, so had Bravo. Somehow, against all odds, this dog had become the guardian of the forest. And now, justice had finally been served. The wildfire had finally been contained, the embers smoldering in the distance as the last of the fire crews packed up their gear. The air still carried the scent of burnt wood, but the worst was over. The damage was great, but thanks to Daniel, Sophia, and Bravo, Healy had been spared a disaster that could have wiped out the town. In the aftermath of the TimberCorp takedown, arrests swept across the country. Executives, bribed officials, and hired enforcers were brought to justice, and the company's entire operation was dismantled. The illegal logging sites were shut down, and new laws were put in place to protect Alaska's forests from corporate greed. For Daniel, however, something had changed. For years, he had convinced himself that his work was over, that retirement was his only path after decades of chasing criminals through wildfire ash and debris. But this case had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose he thought he had lost. When the FBI offered him a position as a consultant on environmental crime, he didn't hesitate. He was done hiding in the wilderness. Instead, he would fight for it. Sophia's article had done more than just expose TimberCorp, it had ignited a movement. Her inbox was flooded with messages from activists, investigators, and fellow journalists who had been silenced by corporate corruption. Inspired by her father's mission, she launched the Mark Lawson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating and exposing environmental crimes worldwide. She and Daniel worked side by side. She gathered stories, uncovered secrets, and shined a light on hidden corruption, while he chased down the criminals responsible, ensuring they faced justice. And through it all, Bravo remained by their side. Bravo recovered fully within a few weeks, his leg healing well thanks to the dedicated care of veterinarians and Sophia's constant attention. But even as he recovered, he never stopped patrolling the land, his instincts always sharp, his loyalty unwavering. Daniel, now his permanent guardian, knew that Bravo wasn't just a dog, he was a protector, a survivor, a soldier who had never abandoned his mission. One night, as Daniel sat on his cabin porch with Bravo at his feet, he watched the Alaskan sunset bleed orange and gold across the sky. Sophia sat nearby, going through new case files, already preparing for their next battle. Daniel reached down, scratching behind Bravo's ear. The dog let out a soft sigh, his eyes half closed in peace. "You never really stopped working, did you?" Daniel murmured. Bravo just thumped his tail against the wooden porch, as if to say, "Neither did you." Months later, a memorial was built in Healy, dedicated to the firefighters, wildlife, and land lost to the wildfire. It stood at the edge of town, facing the mountains where the fire had burned the fiercest. At its center, a bronze statue of a Belgian Malinois stood tall, eyes sharp, body poised, not just a symbol of one dog, but of every guardian who had ever fought to protect the wilderness. The plaque beneath it read, "In honor of Bravo, the guardian of the wild. A hero who never left his post." People came from all over to visit, leaving flowers, dog tags, and messages of gratitude. Parents told their children Bravo's story, and hikers spoke of how, on quiet nights, they could still hear the faint echo of a bark in the wind, as if Bravo was still watching over the land. Daniel, Sophia, and Bravo stood before the memorial on the day of its unveiling. The town gathered behind them. Daniel placed a hand on Bravo's back. "Looks like you finally got the recognition you deserve," he said. Bravo didn't need recognition. He never had. But as the sun set over Healy, and the first stars flickered into the sky, he lifted his head and let out a single, proud bark, one last call to the wilderness, a promise that he would always stay and watch. And Daniel knew that, no matter what came next, none of them would ever stand alone again.